quiero contarles un poquito de mi historia. En mi caso, el camino que me llevó hacia aquí comenzó con Eugenio. Como muchas de ustedes, hubo momentos de dudas, de preguntas sin respuestas claras, años de intentar todo lo que te dijeran, de sentir que necesitábamos hacer algo más. Fue así como llegué al método del doctor Melillo. Al principio, como todo lo nuevo, hubo incertidumbre y nervios, pero con la constancia en casa, rápidamente llegaron los avances. Mejoró sus periodos de atención, su contacto visual y dejó el pañal. Comenzó a comunicarse a su manera, pero por fin yo estaba teniendo las primeras conversaciones con mi hijo, a sus 5 años. Su coordinación mejoró, su interés por convivencias sociales y la lista de avances siguen. Pero eso no fue todo. Después de mi primera visita a Nueva York, yo era otra. Mi visión del autismo cambió. Ahora veía a Eugenio diferente. Ya no eran sus limitaciones el foco de mi día. Empecé a verlo como un niño inteligente, lleno de sorpresas y fortalezas, que ahora era mi trabajo potencializarlas. Y eso ha sido para mí este método, el potencializador de todas las habilidades que ya tenía Eugenio. Ahora solo necesitaba la herramienta que me ayudara a sacarlas, y ya la tenía. Este camino no es perfecto, pero sí hay avances, cambios y más que nada una sonrisa en Eugenio todos los días. Ahora quiero presentarles al corazón de este proyecto, Dani y Mariana. ¿Dónde están? Allá. Volten por favor allá atrás a verlas, Dani y Mariana. Ellas son las 2 directoras del centro, pero más que nada son mamás de niños neurodivergentes que entienden lo que muchas de aquí vivimos. Empezaron su camino individual, preocupadas porque sus hijos recibieran el apoyo necesario para que avanzaran en diferentes áreas de su desarrollo. Conocieron al doctor y a su método hace años, y conforme fue pasando el tiempo, esa espinita de necesitamos esto en México no se apagaba. Y después de años de trabajo junto con el doctor, esto se hace una realidad. Y hoy tenemos la fortuna de contar con la presencia del doctor Robert Melillo, quien nos va a platicar sobre su método, su enfoque y cómo puede impactar positivamente en la vida de nuestros hijos. Es alguien que ha dedicado su trabajo y su pasión a ayudar a familias como las nuestras. Y estoy segura de que lo que escuchemos hoy será de gran valor para todos. Gracias por estar aquí, por su apertura, por su confianza y por permitirse explorar nuevas opciones. Disfruten este espacio, este cafecito y sobre todo este momento para ustedes. Bienvenidas.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, and again, thank you to Daniela and Mariana, who none of us would be here if it wasn't for them and their passion. One of the quotes that I like to use here is this one that says, "No army can withstand an idea whose time has come," especially when it's backed by a lot of warrior moms. There's nothing that can stop that. And I believe what you're going to hear tonight is that idea, and this is the time. Just had the pleasure of speaking with a young woman who was talking to us about her perspective, and she said to me that your method is a game changer. It changes the game. It changes people's life. So I want to give you a little bit of an understanding without getting too technical as to really the foundation of what this is really built on, which is really understanding human brain development. We know that 90% at least of adult mental health issues start in childhood. It really all comes down to the brain. And one of my doctoral degrees is a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience. I've spent my career, the better part of 30 plus years, really trying to understand the brain. First, even from an evolutionary perspective, why do we have brains? Where do they come from? But more importantly, how it impacts brain development. I do have a lot of books that I've written. I have a number of scientific papers. I published over 100 scientific papers. We have a whole group of papers coming out this year. We have another textbook coming out this year. So this is all there that you can read it, and I won't get too much into it, but Disconnected Kids is the book that has been translated into Spanish, and that has sold over 1 million copies. It's translated into 18 languages. And so if you really want to understand a lot of the core of what we do, you can get into that. The first book that I ever wrote was this book here called Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood, an Evolutionary Perspective, where 20 years ago, we really set the foundation of the theories of what was happening and what is actually happening in the brain, and why are we seeing such an epidemic rise of these issues, and more importantly, to be able to use that information to come up with a method to be able to change it in a reproducible way. There is no doubt that we are seeing epidemic rates of childhood and adolescent mental health issues all over the world. This is not an isolated incident. It also is not just the fact that we're recognizing these issues more. There is a real increase in all issues. When we look at autism is the most prevalent. You know, the screen's out. The screen just went out? Okay, there we go. And when we look at the idea that 20% of all children have identified mental health condition annually, while 40% of all children will meet the criteria by 18%. We know that at least 20% of adults have a mental health diagnosis, and all of that is increasing in real time. We know that autism is the fastest growing of all of them. We know that it went from 1 in 10,000 30 years ago to where now it's 1 in 36 in the United States, or 1 in 24 boys. And it's actually even more than that. There's one researcher that recently stated that by 2030, there'd be almost 50% of children in the United States that will have a mental health diagnosis. And that's pretty consistent in most countries. In Europe, I think Mexico is pretty close to that. So this is a huge problem. What we also see is there's a rise in immune issues as well, autoimmune issues. And we see that that is much more prevalent than ever. And we know that there's an overlap between the brain and the immune system that is really not well understood. And that's really a large part of what we're looking at, because when people start to do their search on what is going on with something like autism or a learning issue or ADHD, many times they're told that these problems start in the gut, they start in the immune system, they start with inflammation. And although those issues are important, that's not where it starts. So for me, it's always been about understanding what is the root cause, not just managing symptoms. Someone asked me recently why, my method is not adopted everywhere yet. And because there are many different factors for that. We do have enough research to support it, but a lot of it is that for cost measurements, treatment is really geared to just managing symptoms or managing behaviors, because that seems to be the easiest, but it's definitely the cheapest. But it's not the best. The question should be, why are those symptoms there? Why are those behaviors there? What is happening in the brain, and how do we change that? Because that's what parents want to know, right? We just don't want someone comes in and say, my child can't pay attention, here's a pill for attention. And it will only work temporarily, and it may not work at all, and it's not dealing with the root cause, but this is the most cheapest way of doing it right now. When we look at speech issues, since COVID, there's been a sharp increase in delays or problems with speech. The majority of that is around the autism spectrum, where we have non-speaking autistic kids that are increasing at the fastest rate of anything. So autism is the fastest growing mental health or developmental issue there is, and non-speaking autism is the fastest growing part of that. And that is, when you look at it, it's clear that this is new, meaning that something's happening. And the good news of that, it means that if there are some changes in our lifestyle or in our environment that are increasing the rate, it also means there are things we can do to change it. There's a lot of misconception around genes and whether these are genetic disorders and what that means. Most people think that many issues, and especially when a child is very severe and not able to speak, that there must be some sort of brain injury or damage. There isn't. There must be some sort of genetic mutation, like something like Down syndrome or Fragile X or tuberous sclerosis or some other clear genetic disorder that has a single genetic gene mutation. That is not what any of these issues are. When we look at dyslexia, learning disabilities, processing disorders, ADHD, autism, OCD, Tourette's, tic disorders, there are no single gene mutations at the root of any of those. So what's the problem? That's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And what we see is that when we look at from a child development education perspective, as I said, one of my degrees is in cognitive neuroscience. There was recently a cognitive neuroscientist like me that testified to Congress in the United States. And he was talking about that when we look at generations of children, this is the first generation, this most recent generation that we see of teenagers and young adults that are cognitively less capable than their previous generation. When you go back to the late 1800s, every generation is cognitively more advanced than the generation before. In every measurement, IQ, numeracy, literacy, and that is mostly believed to be because of school, because each generation gets more school. So that it makes sense that if you have more education, that you should see the cognitive abilities and skills increase. And that was true since the late 1800s until this generation. This generation, I think it's Gen Z, is the first generation to underperform their parents on every cognitive measure there is: attention, memory, literacy, numeracy, executive function, and even general IQ, even though they've had more school than previous generations. That should be alarming to anybody that's a parent, because this trend is only believed to get worse. And that's not what we want for our children, but the question is why? Why is this happening? And what happened around 2010 that reversed this cognitive development, it wasn't that school changed, it wasn't the curriculum changed, but predominantly what changed was that this is when schools adopted one-on-one digital technology for children as part of the learning, so that kids were now using individual iPads and technology or computers to learn. And so the tools being used in school to drive learning, and in 80 countries, show that as digital tools are increased, learning goes down. So, and this again is in 80 countries across the world. 5 hours of use equals 2/3 of a standard deviation less in kids who don't use the technology. So adopting digital technology seemed like, that was the great future, that we were every kid was going to have an iPad and a computer, and that it was going to increase learning. And with the internet and with all of the availability of technology, we would think that that would increase. We also know there are other things like cursive writing isn't done anymore because the belief is they don't need it, they just need to type. But we know, and recent studies have shown, that cursive writing has an impact on the brain, because when you write in cursive and you link words together, it helps to link networks in the brain together. They're better. And using actual movement of your hand and 3D space changes the brain in a positive way. So, in the USA, an organization called NAEP has looked at all the states in the different United States. And in any state, data drops as soon as the school has adopted technology. And what's the cause of that? Meaning, why? Why would digital technology seem to impact learning in such a negative way when we're not changing the curriculum or the information? Well, it's the way the brain learns. And this is where a lot of what I'm going to talk about is understanding human brain development is unique. There is no other brains on this planet like humans. A dog's brain, although similar in many ways to a human, the development of the brain and what it's exposed to is really nothing like a human brain. And we don't really fully understand that, or it's not understood in education and psychology as much as it should be. But basically, research on learning says that we have evolved to learn from other humans, not screens. And that the more that we learn from a machine, the less learning there actually is. What does that actually mean? We know there's reduced movement and socialization, and this has an impact on the brain and on specific parts of the brain. We have moved more and more in society to what we look at as more of a left brain world. The left brain is the technological part of our brain. It's linear, it's logical, it's linguistic. It is the part of our brain that really collects data. We have our memory, our conscious memory is in the left brain. We learn facts in the left brain. We learn words in the left brain. We learn early reading in the left brain. But the right brain is what develops first, and we'll discuss this. And the right brain is what puts all that information together. It gives that information context. It gives us a certain understanding at a deeper level that goes beyond the written word. It's the comprehension of what the story is about. We see many kids that have delays in their right brain development, and they may read early. We get many kids that have what's called hyperlexia, which means they can read before the age of 2 or even 18 months, and they teach themselves how to read. I had one child from England that could read at 7 months. It would seem like a good thing, but it's not. That child couldn't speak. And that was partly why. And you start to look at it and say, how can a child read below 1 year and yet not be able to speak? What would the same area of the brain that reads should be the area of the brain that speaks? So this is where the fascination and understanding key questions like that has driven me. But the bottom line is the right brain, the social brain, the emotional brain, the big picture brain is actually more intelligent than the left brain. It processes information really fast from multiple streams of information at the same time. And it understands intuitively, almost instantly, what that information means and how that information can be used practically. It's the common sense part of our brain. And it's the part of our brain that is the emotional intelligent part of our brain. And we're losing that in our school, in our society, and in our education. And when we've moved to digital, where we're not being taught by people through interpersonal relationship, through movement of our body, through physical real time, the left brain lives in a virtual world. The right brain likes the real world. It likes nature. It likes books. It likes people. It wants to learn in reality. And as we move more to a left brain type of society, we're losing, our children are losing. They're not winning. Not only with that, but with other things that we'll talk about. So how do we change this? We must understand brain development. My research says that we learn mostly through the right brain learning, experiential learning, interpersonal learning, physically interacting. The right brain is bigger physically. It processes multiple streams of information. And when we look at things like autism, ADHD, OCD, tics, anger outbursts, inflammation, autoimmune issues, food sensitivities, they all are more related to delays in right brain development where the left brain comes online too early. Another study that came out also shows that same generation, Gen Z, is also not dating one another. They noted that from looking at previous generations, this generation is less socially developed and emotionally developed, and they are not dating one another. They also complain that in social situations, they feel tremendous anxiety. And that is partly what prevents them from being able to have relationships. They have like 1/3 the amount of dating that's going on in that generation. So not only are they less cognitively prepared than the previous generation, but they're socially and emotionally also really impaired compared to previous generations. And it really comes down again to understanding all of this. One survey recently found that out of 5,275 single adults, only 1 in 3 are actively dating. And that 74% of women and 64% of men have not had one date or only a few dates in the past year. Again, why? Most of them talk about their social anxiety and having a problem. Only 1 in 3 and only 40% felt confident in their ability to talk about their feelings with dating partners. Where do we feel our feelings in the right brain? This is emotional intelligence. So we can look at it that the left brain is more our IQ, our intellectual intelligence, our ability to read and do math and memorize facts and details and collect data and be able to use that data as a tool to be able to set goals. But the right brain is where we develop emotional intelligence, where we first connect to our own body. We feel our own body. We connect to our own emotions. And we then learn how to read those emotions on other people. And that's what drives conversation. We have kids that are on the autism spectrum that can speak, but they may only speak one word at a time, or they only speak to needs, or they only repeat words that they hear, or repeat facts that they're obsessed with. What the parents want when they come to us is they want conversation. And the conversation comes from the right brain. The reason why they're not speaking is because of that. So let's talk about human brain development and what makes it unique, but also what makes it uniquely vulnerable, and why we see a massive increase in all of these things that I'm discussing, and what is driving it and what can possibly be done to change it. Before we can do that, we need to understand what the root cause is. So the human brain is unique, number one, because we have the largest brain per body size of any primate. but because we're the only primates that stand upright, we also have the smallest birth canal by far. So that ratio of head size of adult head size to the birth canal size, no other animal has to deal with that. We're the only ones that have that issue. Most other animals, when their brain is born, they have 80 to 90 to 100% of their adult-sized brain and head is there. So that animals like a horse, the baby's head is the same size as an adult. And they can run full out in 90 minutes after they're born. Where we know that in human cases, we're looking at that the human brain is much smaller than that at birth. So to come up with a solution for this, we have really big heads with really small birth canals. What have we done? Nature has affected our genes that build our brain that have made them more sensitive to the environment. 84% of the genes that we have, that all of you have, were there and active during brain development. About 40% of your genes are there just for brain development. And they happen to be the most sensitive genes that we have, because the genes that are going to build the brain need to know when they're in the womb and they can't grow yet versus when they're outside the womb and we need to grow really rapidly. We can't allow the brain to grow to full size in the womb. We have to keep it restricted, which means we have to stop the genes that would build the brain from really becoming fully expressed early, right? I mean, ladies, just imagine, any of you that have had babies, you wouldn't want the head to be 4 or 5 times the size of it, right? Okay, so we have to keep the brain relatively small so that when the human brain is born, we only have about 20 or 25% of the adult brain actually created at that point. That means that 75 to 80% of the brain, the human brain, develops outside of the womb. That means every little step of brain development is really important. And this is something that is not told to anybody. And again, I'm never speaking negatively about anything, but I know, I have very good friends of mine that are pediatricians that work with me. And they tell me, we don't know any of this. And so we've been told to not really look at the milestones so important, but the milestones are hugely important because they're a window into brain development. So just think about that most of our brain happens outside. And it's the longest period of development of any animal. And all of the big stuff like speech and attention and executive function are at the end. And our brains are developing. New research just came out 2 weeks ago showing that the adult brain is still developing from childhood at least until 35. That means that developmental issues, if anything goes wrong in those early steps, it may not fully manifest till 35. And in fact, I've seen a rash recently of young men coming to me in their 30s that were diagnosed with bipolar disorder at that point. But if you go back and look at their childhood history, it started in childhood. But the other thing to understand is that the people that end up with developmental imbalances, they are people that are often some of the most gifted and talented. Any individual that is on the autism spectrum at whatever level, whether they speak or not, are legitimate geniuses in their left brain. And the more impaired they are, the more they can't speak, the more geniuses they are, beyond what you can really even imagine. And this sounds hard to believe and almost impossible because the rest of the world tells us the opposite. Most of therapists and traditionally trained will tell you that they don't know anything. Because if you look at them, they're stimming, they're moving, they can't speak, they can't control their body, and it looks like they don't know anything. They know everything. And this is the mystery of this. This is the fascination. This is the adventure that I look at as my life, is trying to answer that. How could that be? What is actually happening? Why can't they speak? So what we know is, I told you my first textbook, we asked the question, what are brains? When did brains develop on this planet? What was the first brain and why did it evolve? And it turns out, with some of the best researchers in the world, have discovered is that things that don't move don't have a brain. Living things that don't move don't have a brain. Living things that move have a brain. So the first living thing that was able to move on its own power needed a brain and evolved a brain. And so movement is what developed brains on this planet to begin with. And we know movement is what develops children's brains. And the problem with that is that when we look at the part of our brain, because it's so immature at birth, there's an area up there, number 4. That's the motor cortex. That's the part of our brain that gives us voluntary control over movement. But that isn't even close to being formed when we're born. That won't come online for at least another year, and really probably not fully till about 2 years, when we finally get real agency and control of our body. So the problem is we need to move to build the brain. We need to engage the world, engage our senses, and stimulate these genes that will literally build our brain. But the problem is the area of our brain that moves us isn't there. So what's the answer? How do we do that? How do we move and build the brain when that part of the brain isn't there? That's what we have primitive reflexes for. So primitive reflexes are these reflexes that we're all born with. They're there before birth, and they're involved in pre-birth movements. And they come from the lower brainstem, which is active at birth, around the same areas that are letting us breathe and have our heartbeat and our digestive function at a basic level. And they allow us to do basic movements, like rooting and sucking, so a baby can latch on and feed, rolling over, asymmetric and symmetric tonic neck reflexes, grasping responses, spinal galant. These are different reflexes. We look at about 10 of them that are there, and they are the foundation of all movement. So we said movement is the foundation of brain development. The foundation of all movement are primitive reflexes. That's how important they are. And we've known about them for many years. This isn't something that I just made up. We've known about them for over 100 years in brain development. This is something that pediatricians are all trained in and that used to look at routinely. This is something that a traditional pediatric neurologist will still look at within the first year. But the thing about the primitive reflexes is they're there to lead us through development, but then they need to go away or they hold back brain development. So it starts with what we call pre-birth movements. So a baby in the last trimester, at a certain point, at the time, around the time to be delivered, a baby should move into the right position. Did you ever think of, how do they know how to do that? How do they do that? What's the actual process? Well, there are primitive reflexes that are programmed in the brain to get them to move and to twist upside down and backwards into the birth canal. And then literally use these reflexes to move themselves deep enough down in the canal. They should do that without the cord getting wrapped around their neck. That's not supposed to happen. They should move deep enough down in the canal that they actually stimulate the birth process. A mom shouldn't need to be induced. A baby shouldn't need assistance. It should happen naturally because of these reflexes. If a baby's in the breech position, if the cord's wrapped around their neck, if they're sunny side up, if they're not deep enough down, if the mom needs to be induced, what does that mean? It generally means that these reflexes are not there when they're supposed to be. They're not showing up on time because the genes that are building the brain in the womb that would cause those reflexes to become active are behind schedule. They're not damaged, they're not injured, they're just behind schedule. They're not coming out the way they should. The body may be the level of 9 months of gestation, but the brain is not there yet. We also know that this is what leads to many C-sections, is that babies get caught up and they have the cord wrapped around their neck and they're under stress, and so they may need an emergency C-section. But we also know that these reflexes are there to be used to get themselves out of the birth canal. So they should normally go down the birth canal and they twist to the right because they're using a particular reflex, and then they literally squeeze themselves out with what we call the spinal galan, and then when their head comes out and it extends, their whole body stiffens up because of what's called a tonic labyrinthine reflex, and they literally shoot themselves out of the birth canal. And they should be active participants. So therefore, there should never be the need for forceps or for a vacuum or for anybody to reach up and pull the baby out or press on the mom's belly. It should all happen naturally. If it doesn't, what does it mean? It means these reflexes aren't there, the baby's not engaging, they're not doing their job, and that's important because it signifies that the brain is already behind schedule. When the baby comes out, the first reflex and the first milestone is latching. It's the rooting and sucking reflex. A baby should be able to latch on right from the beginning with very little difficulty at all. It shouldn't be a painful process. The mom shouldn't get really a lot of raw or pain. And the quality of the baby sucking is really what induces oxytocin in the mom's brain that causes the milk to be let down. A lot of moms tend to blame themselves if they don't feel like they had enough milk, but often it's because the baby wasn't sucking properly. And if there's any difficulty in latching, that again is right off the bat a key thing. Now, many kids are diagnosed now with tongue ties or lip ties. I think they're overdiagnosed because they're trying to come up with an excuse. Why is the baby not latching? And the truth is, it's because the primitive reflex of rooting and sucking is not there. Then there are all of these other milestones that we've known about for generations. And these milestones have gotten wider and wider and wider. But basically, at 3 to 5 months, a baby should roll over to both sides evenly, and then they should be okay being on their belly. If you have a baby that hates being on their belly, that's a red flag. If they're rolling over from one side and not the other, that's a red flag. If they're not rolling over, that's a red flag. And then once they're on the belly, they should do the commando crawl, arm over arm, leg over leg. Most parents don't even realize that that's a milestone. Parents will tell me, yeah, my baby went and they crawled. Did they do a commando crawl first? No, they just went to crawling. Isn't that what they're supposed to do? No, they're supposed to do a commando crawl on the belly. All of these steps are important because they're building the brain. And we need to have the proper time and the proper way of doing it. And it should be perfectly even. The baby shouldn't favor one side. They shouldn't drag one leg. They should then get up on hands and knees. They should rock back and forth. They should be able to crawl forward. They may wobble a little bit in the beginning, but then they should have it evenly. If they can't do that, if they're stuck and they scoot on their butt, or they roll, or they use some other alternate way of doing it, the baby's trying to go through these steps, but something is preventing them from doing it. What is preventing them? The reflexes either aren't there the way they're supposed to, or they're delayed, or they haven't shown up at all, or they're on one side and they're not on the other. When a baby's dragging a leg or an arm, it's that they have a reflex is there on one side but not the other, and that should never happen. And then they should be able to sit up, they should pull up, stand up, walk along the furniture, and right around 12 months, almost exactly, every child should walk a few steps independently, speak a few words clearly, 3 to 5, and point and have good eye contact and point to like a bird or something, wave, smile. Nonverbal communication. That should all happen right around then. If that doesn't happen, if they don't speak, or if they're not walking, or if they're speaking but not pointing and don't have eye contact, something is not right. And that means that these reflexes now at 1, when a baby does these, all of the primitive reflexes now should go away. They should be gone. And now if they don't go away, they hold the brain back. Once a baby achieves those milestones, they should never be lost. A child shouldn't be able to speak and walk and point and then all of a sudden lose it and not respond to their name or not have any eye contact or lose all the words that they had. And if that happens, that means that, again, these reflexes haven't gone away, and it's actually now caused the brain to kind of crash, and it's also affected the way the right brain and the left brain develop. Now, we've written a lot of scientific papers in my lab. Everything I'm telling you we've researched and we've published about in one way or another. About a year and a half ago, one of the leading journals in the world in the pediatric medicine field, a clinical journal for pediatricians, they reached out to us and they said, all of a sudden we're getting a lot of questions about primitive reflexes. And that's only happening over the past couple of years, and we were wondering why that was happening. So we went out and did some research, and we found it's because of your work. It's because of your lab and your research. And pediatricians are interested. And they want to know more. So will you write a paper about, what a pediatrician should know and about primitive reflexes and why they're important? So we wrote a paper on how evaluating primitive reflexes in early childhood is a potential biomarker for developmental disabilities. That probably the earliest biomarker in where we can identify. Like I said, if you understand these reflexes, you can actually see that if there was a problem with the birth, it's already a red flag. Everybody talks about early intervention, but it really isn't done much. I mean, the earliest maybe 18 months to 2 years, but you could identify issues right from the first couple of months if you know what's happening. So this paper was published in that journal. So, it does mean that they are starting to listen, and it is starting to have an impact. So when we talk about brain development, building a brain, it's kind of like building a house. It starts from the bottom up. The foundation of any house needs to be solid before you're going to put, a floor, another floor, and before you're going to build the roof. The foundation of the human brain is the brainstem. This area here called the medulla and the pons. This is the foundation of brain development, and it's fully active at birth. This is where the primitive reflexes come from. This is where they're located. There's other nuclei in that area that are also very important that regulate things like digestion and heart rate and the immune system that we'll talk about as well. So what needs to happen is, just like you need to have the foundation is fully solid before you're going to build a house, we need the foundation of the brain to be solid before we're going to build the brain on top of it. What does it mean by being solid in the brain? It means that area needs to be fully mature. If the reflexes are still there, if they haven't gone away, if we have what's called retained primitive reflexes, then that brainstem area has not fully matured. And if it hasn't fully matured, the rest of the brain hasn't fully matured. And so what we've proven in our research is that all of these neurobehavioral issues start with the brain is more immature than it should be. It's held back. Why? Because the reflexes haven't gone away. And the foundation has never been able to be fully built. So the brain develops from the bottom up, and then once the brain grows, it then comes down and regulates everything. The brain regulates everything in our body. It regulates our heart rate. It regulates our digestion. It regulates the release of hormones, growth hormone, thyroid hormone. It regulates our digestive system. It regulates our immune system. It takes the lead. Even though a lot of this isn't fully understood, we know that this is what is happening. And what we see is that it all starts with the primitive reflexes being there as the foundation of movement. You understand now why they're there and how they're unique in humans. And then they need to get the brain and cause the brain to mature in that first year, going through all of those milestones, and then they need to go away or become what we call integrated into the nervous system. And now they allow for more complex movement. Now a child can stand and walk and run and jump and develop fine motor skill. And the most complex motor act that's ever been achieved is speech. This is really hard to do. And so that is the ultimate version of the motor system. And then on top of that, that's where all of these cognitive skills come from. Literally grows out of the motor cortex, that area 4, and then 6, and then 8. Those areas literally grow as the brain is maturing. It grows up and then forward and then down, and then regulates everything. And then, when that is mature enough, then a child can learn in a proper way, both behaviorally, emotionally, and academically in school. And so if that doesn't happen that way, that's a problem. The most unique thing of the human brain, though, is the degree of difference between our right hemisphere and our left hemisphere. We know, and we wrote a paper on this a couple of years ago, talking about that from the beginning of time. We talked about when did brains first evolve. And in the fossil record, we know that those animals were lateralized, meaning they use one side of their body differently than the other. That means their brains were lateralized. It means that the right and left brain is the blueprint. From the very beginning, there's been a right and left side of the brain. But we also know as you go up the animal kingdom, the more different the right and left brain are, the more specialized they are, the more intelligent the animal is. We have the most lateralized or asymmetric brains of any animal. We have the most independent brains because even though our brains are bigger than any other primate, certainly as our brain gets bigger, and if our two sides of our brain are supposed to do almost the same thing or work together, that the bridge between them would get bigger. But it's actually gotten smaller. Why? Because having two independent brains that operate almost individually is a great advantage. It's like having two brains in one. When we look at attention, we look at something like ADHD. What does that mean? People throw that term out. Oh, they have ADHD. Well, there's different types of attention, and there's different types of ADHD. There's a left brain type and a right brain type. We have left brain attention and right brain attention. The fact is that 4 out of 5 types of human attention are right brain driven, but primarily we look at the left brain having very detailed, narrowed, hyper-focused, short-term attention. Meaning when you really need to hyper-focus on something, like you're memorizing an equation or you're memorizing numbers, or you're reading a book and you're trying to really remember facts, or you're doing something really detailed, you're filling out something that's really important, you need that left brain to hyper-focus. The right brain has more of an open, sustained type of attention. It's more what we need, let's say, if you're sitting here right now listening to me, you need to have kind of an open attention. You're focused on me and what I'm saying, but you're aware of what else is happening, and it's sustained. It's happening for a while. And that's kind of what you need more in a classroom. The example of that is, let's say you have a bird, and a bird needs to look for a seed to eat, and the seed is on the ground amongst pebbles. And you need to be able to isolate the seed from the pebbles. You have to be able to see very fine detail and focus very fine detail to see that seed. But at the same time, you need to be able to look out for a predator that could be attacking you and is going to kill you. Not, I need to do this and then that. That doesn't work. I can't do that and not look for food. I'll die. I need to do both at the exact same time. I need to have one part of my brain focusing detail while the other is focusing on the big picture at the same time. We need two different brains that can do that. And that's why having two different hemispheres is an incredible advantage. But it also leaves us vulnerable, because as the brain grows, if we don't have really perfect balance and synchronization, then we can develop certain areas of our brain become too strong and others don't fully mature. And that is what basically is at the foundation of every developmental and mental health issue. So what we see is that this is called a functional disconnection. So what happens, and the way that the right brain and the left brain get built, and how we get all of these different functions, is that the right brain takes the lead in development for the first 3 years, and it keeps the left brain from coming online too early. Then the left brain comes on for the next 3 years and keeps the right brain in its place while the left brain comes online. At the end of 6 years, we have the foundational differences of the right and left brain. But that's just the beginning, because then both sides of the brain, as they mature, become more and more and more specialized, more and more different, but they also need to become more and more synchronized and balanced and faster, which is hard to do, and that all needs to happen properly. Anything that interferes with that sequence of development, if one side of the brain is delayed in development, if one side of the brain comes online too early, it disrupts this normal balance, and the brain is very dynamic and very fast and needs to have a near perfect balance and synchronization. Anything that disrupts that can affect any aspect of what our brain is regulating, which is everything. Our emotions. Emotions are just networks in the brain. Happiness, anger, pride, these are left brain emotions. And the left brain is more motivated. The right brain is really more emotions like sadness, fear, shame, embarrassment, guilt, fear of rejection. So when we talk about depression, for instance, what is depression? We know that if we have too little joy and happiness in the left brain and the frontal areas, and we have too much sadness combined with shame and guilt, that's the definition of major depressive disorder. That's what it is. In the brain, that's what's actually happening. How do we change that? Easy. We stimulate the left brain networks for joy and pride. We inhibit the networks on the right side for shame and guilt and sadness. and we restore balance to our emotions. Normally, all those emotions are important, but we shouldn't get stuck one way where we can't get out of it. We need to have flexibility in our brain. When we lose flexibility, it's because we've lost balance in our brain. And most of that balance is lost in childhood. It may not manifest fully until even in our 30s, but it started then. And it can be changed then. Meaning we can prevent somebody from having bipolar or schizophrenia in their 20s or 30s. We know schizophrenia shows up in the 20s. If you look at identical twins, one of whom gets schizophrenia in the 20s and the other one doesn't. They went back and looked at their first 5 years of development on videotape. The parents had videotaped their development. They had a group of people like you, not trained health professionals, look at the videos and said, one of these children will end up with schizophrenia, one won't. Which one is which? The non-trained group was almost 100% of the time able to pick out why, because the child that got schizophrenia couldn't crawl. They would fall over when they tried to sit up. They couldn't roll. They moved in a more awkward and clumsy way. Why? Because they didn't have their reflexes go away. Why? That's hard to say exactly. There's a lot of factors to that. But the bottom line is, if we were able to make this child move like this child ended up in their 30s, not in 20s, not having schizophrenia, with identical genes. So would it be reasonable to say that this one would not have ended up with that also? So this is what we're looking at. This is the power of this and understanding why human brain development and what's unique about it and what we can do. The fortunate thing is we do have something called neuroplasticity, which means we can change the brain at any point. The whole idea that there was this window of the first 3 years is complete. Nobody really considers that anymore if you know anything about the brain. Even the first 5 or 6 years. They're important, but they're not a window that closes. The window never closes. We can change it at any given time. We have kids in their 20s that went their whole life not speaking, and we got them to speak. We get them to feel their body. We get them to feel emotions they've never felt before in their life. And this is where a lot of our efforts are. So just really quickly, the right brain develops first. The first job of the right brain is attachment. The first job is survival. Humans have survived because we're social. We're part of a group. We attach to others. We need to work as a group. Babies can't survive on their own. They need to be attached to parents that will protect them and love them. And then as we grow, we need to be attached to a group of people that will protect us and love us and keep us safe. This is the whole purpose of attachment. And when people have attachment disorders, we know something in the right brain goes awry. Things aren't developing. But we need to be part of a group. If you were in the Stone Age and you didn't get along with your group because you just weren't a nice person or you were rude or whatever, they kicked you out. And that was literally a death sentence. You could not survive on your own. So all of us in our right brain also have something called rejection sensitivity. We know that if we get rejected by the group, some people feel like they're going to die. And that is being driven crazy by social media right now, especially in young girls. My wife and I worked with a young girl who was 12, 13 years old, tiny little thing, very sweet, really nice family. But when her parents tried to take her phone or tried to tell her, disconnect her from her social media group, she went berserk. Literally, this little girl threw chairs through the window. Police had to be called to the house 3 times. When we tried to intervene, the girl swallowed sleeping pills at a fake attempt, but at a fake attempt to kill herself. Why? Because when she was disconnected from her group, she felt like she was going to be rejected and she was going to die from it. That's literally what she felt. It was death. And she fought like someone who was dying. You know, the strength of someone who's being, attacked by somebody. So this is how our brain works. The right brain is about attachment, and first it's about feeling our body, something called interoception. We feel our body. A baby from the moment they're born needs to be able to tell a parent if they're in pain, if they're hungry, if they're thirsty, if they're hot, if they're cold, if they need to be changed, and if they're tired. And smell and taste are involved with that. And there's an area of the brain on the right side of the brain called the insula. This is where we have interoception. Most kids that are non-speaking autistic have very low or almost complete absent interoception. They have incredibly high pain threshold. I had one kid that literally broke his arm in half and didn't cry. Not at all. He was in the ambulance, and the people in the ambulance were, how is he not crying right now? They stuck a needle in his arm, he didn't even notice. We know that many of them don't feel hot and cold. They can walk on the ground when it's very hot, doesn't bother them. They may not feel hungry. They don't feel full. They may not really want to eat much. Or they may eat and eat and eat till they throw up and then go back and eat again. They may drink excessive amounts of water. I had a boy from Puerto Rico, was 14, who could speak, but was very autistic. And I was talking to the mom about this interoception piece, and she said, my son has always drank a lot of water, excessive amounts. And she said, I thought, well, it's hot, he's thirsty. And then at a certain point she realized, no, there's no way, nobody could be that thirsty. And she said to him, you drink too much water, only drink when you're thirsty. And he looked at her and he said, how do I know when I'm thirsty? That's the definition of interoception. The right brain is in the first 3 years learning many of these foundational skills, but we don't remember learning it. The right brain doesn't form conscious memories. We don't form conscious memories until the left brain comes on at after 3 years. That's why most people have what's called childhood amnesia. None of us should remember before the age of 3, unless your left brain came online too early. I had a 24-year-old autistic boy who was adopted in Vietnam. His mother was, his birth mom really struggled. He had a family from Germany, a lovely family, adopted him at birth. And he's never spoken a word. But yet, he's able to spell on a letterboard, and he's enrolled in college courses in animal psychology. And I asked him, I said, what's your earliest memory? And he said, I remember being in the womb. I remember my birth mom was sad. And I remember saying to him, were you born autistic? And he said, no, I wasn't. I knew I could do things. And the mom even said he was speaking at 6 months. He was way ahead of schedule in most things. And then at 1, he lost it all. And he said, at 1, I lost complete connection to my body. I didn't feel my body anymore. And that's when I became autistic. What is he describing? So the left brain, as we said, the right brain takes the lead for the first 3 years. And at 1, when the reflexes go away, the right brain should really kick in. And between 2 and 3 years is really when it really kicks in. That's when that insula, when that part of our brain where we feel our body really kicks in. Right? So, I lost it. Hang on. That's when we feel our body. As we're moving through the world, we develop this interoception, and then we develop what's called proprioception. there's an area in our brain, two areas, where we really create maps, literally a map, a 3D map of our body in our brain. So we see our body in our brain. You all can see your own body in your brain. Once you see it and you feel it, you then develop a map of how to move it. So that I know this is my hand and I can close my eyes, my hand is here, and because I know it's here, I can move it. And I have a map. Many of these kids tell us they don't see their body in their brain and they can't move their body because of that. And the biggest part of the map is the face, the mouth, the tongue, and the lips. It makes up only almost 1/3 of the map. And this is for verbal and nonverbal communication. Speaking, expressing our emotion through facial expression, and then mimicking other people's facial expression so that we know what they're feeling. We have to first feel interoception and feel our body to understand what other people feel in their body. In the insula on the right side is not only interoception, it's also where we have empathy. If I don't feel pain, I can't understand your pain. I can't empathize with you. I might sympathize with you, which is more of a left brain thing, but I can't really empathize. We know kids on the autism spectrum struggle with empathizing. With ADHD, they have trouble empathizing because of that. But then on top of that come right brain emotions. Things like sadness. We get many kids with right brain delays where their left brain comes online too early that just will laugh or get giddy or silly out of nowhere. Middle of the night, parents hear them laughing in their bed. Why? Their left brain is just firing off. And then they might also just get angry really fast. The left brain kind of has two emotions, laughing, silly, giddy, or anger. That's it. The right brain is sadness. The right brain is shame, guilt, embarrassment. Shame and guilt and embarrassment form about 18 months in the right brain, and it's triggered in a child mostly by a mother's facial expression of disgust. So imagine you have a little 18-month-old that's walking around, and the mom's in the bathroom putting her makeup on, and the baby's around, and all of a sudden it takes their toy or something and reaches in the toilet bowl, you know, and dips a toy in there and puts it to the mouth, and the mom goes, "Oh, no," right? Don't do that. The disgusting face, and that triggers in the baby guilt and shame and embarrassment, and they get this negative feeling in their body, and they learn, oh, I shouldn't do that. The left brain is reward driven. When we do something good, we get a shot of dopamine, and it says, good, do that, keep doing that. The right brain we learn through negative reinforcement, through what's called non-reward. Ew, that's disgusting, don't do that. And that triggers it. And that's the way the mother is supposed to do it. But we get many kids with right brain delays, they don't feel sad. They don't feel fear. They'll elope. They'll run out. They'll run in the middle of the street. They have no sense of danger. They're not afraid of the dark. They're not afraid of strangers. They're not afraid of anything. They don't feel embarrassment, shame, or guilt. And they don't fear rejection. They often don't seek kids right from the beginning. We had this beautiful little boy, Iker, that wrote these poems. And again, this is a child that, at one point couldn't really speak and didn't know what was in there. And he wrote this beautiful story about a little monster that other children were afraid of. And he would stay back, and all the other children would play, and he would just stay by himself, which really describes what we see with autistic kids. They don't approach other children. That should be the main driving force of a child. Going up to other children, playing, moving around, running, chasing each other, rolling around. In those first 3 years, the toddler years, that's when they learn the foundation of social development and interpersonal and reading other people's emotions and learning the rules subconsciously of social engagement. And he said that the other children were afraid of him because he was a monster, and that he wouldn't go up to them because he was afraid he would scare them. And then one little boy came over to him who wasn't afraid and asked him to come and play, and they became friends forever. It's just, this is the beauty of what's going on in them. He can type that story. It's amazing. But many of these kids, they don't have that sense of attachment. They're not approaching. Why? Not because they're not raised in it, not because they're not raised by good families, but because that network of the brain is not there. The left brain is more isolated. The left brain likes to be independent. The left brain isn't driven by relationships. It's driven by facts and details and goals, and it's motivated to do that. The left brain likes to do things over and over repetitively. The right brain likes new things. The left brain is naturally obsessive, compulsive. We know that tics or stimming is activated by overactivity of a specific network called Brodmann area 6 in the left brain. It normally would be inhibited or stopped by the right brain. OCD, obsessive thoughts, come from an area called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Brodmann area number 9 and 46. We know compulsive behavior comes from what's called the orbital frontal cortex, area 11 and 12. On the left, it's inhibited and stopped on the right. Normally, the right brain should come on first and control the left brain. But what happens is that if the brain is developing and the primitive reflexes don't go away, it then disrupts this imbalance. And in kids on autism or right brain delay or OCD, that left brain comes online too early and it crashes that right brain. That's why they lose that connection to the right insula. They lose that connection to their body. They lose their map. The right brain and the insula is where we get what's called body ownership. That's where we become a person. When we build this whole map in the right brain, we become a whole person. When we have ownership of our body and we're self-aware, then we can have agency of our body and we can move our body. Then the motor part of our brain kicks in, and now we can move our body in the way that we want to. If that doesn't develop, the left brain is generating these automated movements, these patterns, and these stimming behavior, and the child is not in control. They're never in control. They don't want to even do most of the things they're doing. They don't want to make those noises. They don't want to do those things. They don't want to have this OCD tendencies, but they can't stop it because the right brain isn't there to stop it. And what we want to do is bring that right brain on. And all of the brain can be impacted in different ways. So therefore, again, this is called a functional disconnection. It's this developmental imbalance. It is the root cause, and mostly it starts with these retained primitive reflexes that lead to these imbalances, and we can change that. We can change that by integrating the reflexes and removing the blockage. We can do that by stimulating the brain through sound or light or movement or smell or taste or vibration, or by doing things to stimulate their inner ear, by eye movements, by doing cognitive-based activities, virtual reality, video games that are targeting different networks in the brain. We have advanced tools like lasers where we can target these specific areas where we can activate one side and inhibit another. We have electrical devices that are safe and have been used for decades that can be used to balance out these networks. But we have to start from the bottom up. Now, the idea that there's also an imbalance in what we call the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And this is what leads to issues like leaky gut or malabsorption or vitamin and mineral issues or problems with eczema or an overactivity of the immune system. The right and left brain regulated, the brainstem. So all of this is secondary. It doesn't start in the gut. It doesn't start in inflammation. It starts in the brainstem and the brain, and it affects those things. It doesn't mean they aren't important. We just have a big paper coming out on the neuroimmunology of how the brain regulates the immune system and the balance of inflammation and anti-inflammation, why we form antibodies for foods. All of that is important, but that's not the root cause. And all of it is part of our program. And all of it is what we do. And that ultimately is what the Melillo method is all about. It's my 30-year search to understand what's happening in the brain so that we can change it. It started with my own children, and now it's expanded to millions of other children literally across the world, but not just children, but adults, because it's all brain development. So again, there's a lot here. I've given you a lot of information. I have videos and other things that you might be able to access that explain the whole thing better. I am doing a lecture tomorrow night to a group of doctors, and it's going to be longer and much more detailed. But, you know, it might be open for other people. But I do appreciate so much that you're here. I'm so excited about this center. We've really spent a lot of time training. You know, I created a company in 2008 called Brain Balance Achievement Centers. And we went from 1 center to 150 centers in 10 years. And we were able to have very consistent, reproducible results. And that company still exists. But this model is a whole different level. That's more of an academic learning center. This is a full-blown healthcare facility, and we're doing much more intricate, much more complex. But we learned from that how to be able to scale up and keep a level of quality and consistency so that if someone came and saw me in New York or saw my staff, they would get the same effect here. And that's the difference with the Melillo centers. There are people that are certified in my method that have a basic level. But what we do here is the highest level. And nobody else has access to that information. Nobody else is trained personally by us at that level. And we wanted to bring that to the world because we need it. Everybody needs it. But, you know, it's because of these two women and their passion for their own children and their recognition that they tried a lot of things and it didn't work. And this was the answer, that they wanted to bring this to your community. And I'm so happy that they did. I'm so grateful and humble. And thank you very much for being here. And we can open it up for some questions if you'd like.
Thank you.
Thank you, doctor. Yo creo que muchas de nosotras vamos a querer empezar el libro hoy mismo. Yo lo leí hace años, pero lo voy a volver a leer porque definitivamente quiero saber más de todo lo que pasó ahí. Pero bueno, tenemos poquito tiempo para preguntas. Atención, señoritas, les voy a pedir, esto no es momento para tener una consulta individual con el doctor. Entonces, yo sé que todas tenemos dudas y preguntas. Vamos a tratar de mantener las preguntas para que nos ayuden a todos de manera general. Y todas las preguntas que tengan específicas ya de sus casos las pueden mandar al mail que está ahí abajo. Creo que es
melillomethodmexico.com.
¿Ok? Y ahí ya vemos caso por caso. Pero ahorita, ¿quién quiere hacer una pregunta? Tenemos por allá una mano. ¿Te puedes parar, por favor?
Hola, muchas gracias por la plática, estuvo súper interesante. Yo tenía una pregunta, ¿cuál es la diferencia? Digo, yo no sé mucho, pero entre el Melillo Method y todos estos lugares que han abierto tipo Brain Code, que te ponen pues como transmisores, y otra que abrieron del doctor Eduardo Barragán, que te meten como una tipo cámara, que fue lo que salió en la película de los 2 hemisferios de Luca. Quería saber cuál es la diferencia o si más o menos es lo mismo.
Yeah, it starts with understanding what you're trying to change. One thing you might be describing is hyperbaric oxygen, where they're in a thing where you're just giving them more oxygen. These kids don't need more oxygen most of the time. If there is a brain injury, that can help. But in the vast majority of patients we work with, there is no brain injury. There is no genetic mutations. We do work with kids or adults with genetic mutations as well, and they also can have imbalances. But another thing of what you're describing is basically neurofeedback, where you're reading brain waves. We do that as well. And we do use a therapy called neurofeedback, but that's something that should be used much further down the road because it's a top-down approach. And most of these therapies that are out there don't understand what is the root cause. They don't understand this imbalance between networks, between the right and left hemisphere. They don't understand primitive reflexes. And if you're not addressing the primitive reflexes and you're not addressing this hemispheric imbalance, no matter what tool you're using, you're not really addressing the root cause. And you're not going to get really as good results as you should, or those results might be more temporary and not long-term. So it's not about the tool. There's a lot of tools, and we have all of the tools that anybody else has. It's about how you use them. What is the problem? And the basic thing is that if you're going to go out somewhere, how many people here have a child with an issue and that's why you're here? Okay. Now, before today, if you could answer me, have you ever really been with somebody, other than if you've read my book, have you ever had any doctor or therapist that described what was actually happening in the brain? How many told you exactly what was happening in the brain? Right, look around, not a lot. If they're not really describing clearly what's happening in the brain and how it got that way and how they're going to change it, chances are they're probably not going to change it in the most optimal way. So that's what it starts with me. It's not just about someone that has some bright, shiny tool. You know, we go on Instagram and there are all these people saying, I do this or we do this, and it can be very confusing. But what is the act? What are they trying to do? What is the result? Like a laser is a great tool, but if you just put it all over the brain, you actually may make the imbalance worse. So you need to really understand what the issue is, and that's the difference between our method. It's incredibly comprehensive, but all of our treatment plans are also individualized. No two patients have the same plan. We don't give people like a generic program and tell them go home and do this over and over and over and just pray for results. We give you an individualized program based on an extensive evaluation of your child or patient, and then we put together a program that is goal-directed. We have specific goals, overall goals and daily goals in every single activity, and it's designed to create change functionally by addressing the root issue. And we do it in a way where everybody is involved, the family, what we do. We work together. We spend a lot of time educating the families. We give you access to videos of how we're going to do activities at home. And it's always evolving. It's always changing based on the development and the developmental goals. And it's all data-driven every day. So no other program is really designed like that in the world, and that's really what makes it unique, and that's the most unique part of the Melillo method. Yes, right there in the white. Yep, you.
Yo tengo una pregunta que mencionaste desde el principio. En casos de niños con desórdenes genéticos o síndromes raros, donde genéticamente están alterados, y por más que se trata de luchar con eso, pues el padecimiento de base siempre prevalece, aun cuando ya son mayores. ¿Estos métodos funcionan?
So I'm sorry, it was a little bit, but I think what she asked me was, would this work with a child with genetic disorder?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, because even in genetic issues tend to be global. they affect the whole brain equally. There are very specific things that happen, like for instance in Down syndrome. There are what we call on neurons dendritic spines that have little mushroom caps on the end of it. And in Down syndrome, they don't have those mushroom caps on any of their neurons. And that little difference is the difference in Down syndrome. So we see that those children are usually delayed, but we also see that they can have imbalances that can develop, and they can be very uniquely gifted in areas of their brain. And we can have children with Down syndrome that have a right brain delay and have overactive left brain and can be diagnosed with autism as well. Or we can have a child that is gifted in the right brain and has a left brain delay, and they may struggle with things like dyslexia or learning disabilities or processing disorders or depression. But the imbalance is where most of the symptoms come from. And we can change that imbalance. Many of them also have these retained reflexes that we can change. So even in any genetic disorder, there's a wide variety of abilities where you may have some children that are severely impaired and non-speaking and other children that seem barely impaired at all. Some of the mutations may even be in the parents and they don't have any impairments. So a lot of the impairment and the degree of the impairment is really relative to the degree of the imbalance, and that's something that we can change. And so we can usually, again, in a measurable, goal-directed, functional way, we can improve their ability to function and their brain function in almost all cases. Yes.
Gracias. En niños con TDAH, el método funciona a balancear imbalances químicos, que usamos un medicamento normalmente para balancearlo.
Yeah. So the idea of a chemical imbalance in the brain is not something that really is looked at much in science or neuroscience as a root cause. The neurotransmitters are just messengers within a pathway. And if you're not producing dopamine in a dopamine pathway, it's not because you don't have dopamine, it's because that pathway isn't active. Dopamine is more of a left brain neurotransmitter. Serotonin is a right brain neurotransmitter. So we do have differences there. Medication is believed to alter the receptor sensitivity. There's no medication out there that actually increases a neurotransmitter. What it does is it either increases the sensitivity of receptors or it may increase the length of time that the neurotransmitter is in the synaptic cleft, like Ritalin or like a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. But it's not really altering the amount of neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are there. They can be produced. They're not being produced because there's underdevelopment or immaturity in a network primarily. And by activating that network, by stimulating it, it will grow. And as it grows, we're going to grow the ability to produce the neurotransmitter and to receive the neurotransmitter. And that's why medication is only temporary. And medication doesn't have any long-term effects on the brain. It doesn't create neuroplasticity because it's just managing these symptoms, and that can be helpful, that can be useful, but it isn't a long-term solution. And the largest study ever done on ADHD, which was a 20-year study looking at the use of Ritalin or methylphenidate, found that in the first 14 months, the children that were medicated seemed to do better than the children that were unmedicated. And I will say that when there is a right brain type of ADHD, because there's also a left brain type of ADHD, that's very different, in fact, the exact opposite. So that's why just a label of ADHD doesn't mean anything. There's type 1, there's type 2, there's type 3. Type 1 is more of a left brain delay. Type 2 and 3 is more of a right brain delay. And they require completely different treatments. Medication for right brain delays like stimulants usually clearly make them function better. Kids that have left brain delays, they usually don't respond to the medication very well. But what the study showed was that in the first 14 months, there seemed to be an improvement. But then by 3 years, the difference between the children that were medicated versus weren't medicated was gone. And then at 18 to 20 years, there was no difference in outcome whatsoever. The only difference was that the children that were medicated were 2 centimeters shorter on average, and that they seemed to be more immature because it seemed to impact the onset of puberty. So what we're doing is addressing really, again, the root issue, which is in networks, which is in what's called functional connectivity. We're not just trying to address, chemicals. That, again, is really just managing symptoms, and that can be helpful, but it really doesn't have any significant long-term benefit. Okay? Yes. I think we only have 2 more, possibly.
I understood from what you were telling us that once the left brain comes online earlier, then it tends to overdevelop. So I was wondering, as you develop the right side and it balances out, will children or even older children and even adults lose things like hyperfocus that they tend to depend on in their daily lives? Like, will it just balance out and the brain function normally, or will those sort of superpowers that they get, just to call them something, will they remain?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And we have a very clear answer for that based on years of data. As you said, and I think it's a good way of describing it, the more superpowers an individual has, the more likely they are to also develop an imbalance. And this is true, very true. I mean, I have a daughter of mine, for instance, that grew up with mostly dyslexia, but also had a lot of anxiety and struggled with some depression and eating disorders. But she's also like a genius with writing songs. Her music ability and singing is incredible, and she's one of the top singer-songwriters in Nashville. And we do a podcast called the Right Brain Podcast, WRITE, in which we interview some of the leading songwriters, actors, entrepreneurs, people in the creative fields. And it's really interesting because almost all of them were dyslexic. Almost all of them struggled in school or with math. Almost all of them struggled with self-esteem issues and fear of being judged, even though they're performers, right? And many of them then had substance abuse issues, and many of them tried to attempt suicide, even though they're some of the most talented people on the planet. With someone on the autism spectrum, they're incredibly bright. And so what we do when we have children or adults that are a certain level, we use a neuropsychological test called the Wyatt. It's a cognitive test. That's the gold standard. And one of my degrees is in neuropsychology. And in the Wyatt, there are certain subsets. So like word reading is a measurement of left brain skill. Reading comprehension is right. Basic math operations is left. Problem solving is right. And we, over the years, 25 years, we have thousands of these tests. And what we often see is that we may get kids that have, like an autistic kid may be word reading. They may be in 3rd grade, but they're reading at a 10th grade level. But their reading comprehension is at a kindergarten level. So they have this unevenness where we're able to see that they have overactivity of certain networks, and those networks are too strong, stronger than they should be. And then we work with them, and what happens is the weak side goes up, but the strong side doesn't come down. They're still reading at a 10th grade level, but now they're comprehending at a 10th grade level or at an 8th grade level. And throughout the years, we've almost never seen the top score come down. We've only seen the bottom score come up. So they don't lose their ability and their gift. They just learn how to be able to modulate it and regulate it appropriately.
En el caso de mutaciones genéticas específicamente, es más complejo que funcione el método. Me refiero a que el gen tal vez por su naturaleza tiende a comportarse de manera distinta, de manera errónea, se tiene que acompañar por más tiempo o puede ser que ganen ciertos hitos y se pierda, o sea, que se integren los reflejos y después otra vez regrese a donde estaba. ¿Eso pasa?
If you can say it again, I didn't really understand completely what she was saying. The first thing she said, if she can say, was she talking about teens? Is that what she's talking about? Or? Okay, and genetic disorders. Okay, yes. Okay, so what is the question about the genetic disorder? I already answered a question on it, so is it different than that?
Que se comporta de cierta manera, a lo mejor que hay una regresión, como perder los hitos que se ganaron por genética, y esto necesita un acompañamiento más largo, o tiene la misma oportunidad que si no hubiera este gen, porque en la genética a veces hay regresiones, o sea, logras hitos y regresas.
Yeah, if there's a genetic disorder, then there may be limitations that don't exist with someone who doesn't have a genetic disorder. So it may take longer. We may not be able to get them to the same level of function that we will get because we're not going to change the genetic mutation. That's there. But how much that genetic mutation is impacting them and how much maybe because of this functional developmental imbalance, we're not sure. But again, we have very clear goals and we have data-driven measurements so that we know, for instance, we grade primitive reflexes from 0 to 4. 0 is where they should be. No one should have primitive reflexes beyond the age of 1. 4 means they're fully there, they haven't gone away at all. And when we look at 10 different reflexes, a child may be all 4s, or maybe some 3s and some 4s. And we come up with a number from 0 to 4. That overall number may be 3.85. Our goal is to get that reflex, all those reflexes, to a total score of 0 to 0.5. When we're looking at a child that's between 3.5 and 4, that's probably going to take around 18 months. It could be longer, or if it's, between 3 and 3.5, it could be 12 to 18 months. If it's between 2 and 3, it might be 12 months. And so we can measure where they're at when we reevaluate them. A child with a genetic disorder, it might take longer, where it might take a child, 12 months to get rid of the reflex. It might take them 2 years. But we don't always know until we start doing it. We can get rid of the reflexes even if there is a genetic disorder, and that has an impact. How that's going to manifest fully, we don't always know.
I found it very interesting that you said that dietary restrictions that usually are, promised like the solution. But you said that you as well use diet and nutrition along the Melillo method. How important is, nutrition for these kids? As you said, it's not the real cause because it comes from the brain. But I think we have all fallen into some methods of reducing or cutting off gluten processed.
It's very important. We do it with every single patient. But again, understanding why is it there? And again, why do they have a leaky gut? Why do they have food sensitivities? Why are they reacting to foods? And most importantly, again, what foods are they actually reacting? Just putting a child on just a gluten, dairy-free diet doesn't make sense unless you understand what's happening in that child's immune system. If they have a sensitivity, it's because they've developed antibodies against those foods. No one should develop antibodies against foods. But going back further, it comes down to the balance of what we call the sympathetic and parasympathetic, which are nuclei that are in the brainstem where the primitive reflexes come from. When we're born, we're in this sympathetic fight or flight state. That's the way we're supposed to be born. The heart rate is very fast, 140. And the gut is open and leaky when we're born. That's the way we start out life. Most people don't understand that. They think that the leaky gut happens because of inflammation in the gut. That's not what happens. We're born with a leaky gut. The reason for that is babies don't produce their own antibodies. Now, antibodies are different from white blood cells. White blood cells are what kills infections, virus, mold, bacteria, fungus, parasites. Antibodies are more like warning signals. It lets us know when we're being invaded, and it attaches and calls in the white blood cells or the killers, and then it forms a memory. We should only form antibodies against foreign invaders. We should never form antibodies against our own body, our own skin, like in eczema, or our own, lungs, like in asthma, or certainly not our own brain, like in something like PANS and PANDAS, which is way overdiagnosed, by the way. And so the gut is open and leaky to begin with. We also don't want to produce acid and enzymes in the beginning because they would literally kill those antibodies in the baby's gut, right? So we have an open, leaky gut, as I said, because the baby isn't producing antibodies and they get it from the mom's breast milk. Those are really large proteins that wouldn't go through a normal closed-up stomach lining. And we don't want acid and enzymes to kill those antibodies. We don't need a lot of blood flow, and we don't need a lot of movement because we don't have any solid waste. But as the baby's going through the first year of development, as they're moving, these milestones are coming on and going away, from that same area in the brainstem, then another nucleus develops called the parasympathetic nucleus. And now that starts to turn off the sympathetic fight or flight nucleus. So now, around 6 or 7 months, when a baby starts eating solid food, and when their reflexes are going away, and when they start to produce their own antibodies and they don't need the moms, now the gut closes up. Now we start producing acid and enzymes that digest the food, but also form the right environment pH so that good bacteria live and bad bacteria don't. Mold, fungus, yeast, parasites should never be able to live in our gut in anybody if we have enough acid, if our parasympathetic nervous system is working. Anybody that has mold or a parasite in their gut, it's because they're in this sympathetic fight or flight state. Why? Because they probably still have retained reflexes. There are people out there, I see it on the Instagram, that talk about that babies are in this stress response and it's because they have mold in their body. Completely wrong. They're in this stress response because their parasympathetic nervous system hasn't developed, the reflexes haven't gone away, they don't produce acid, and we're all exposed to mold and parasites. I had one child recently from Panama who had little white worms in his poop. And the mom showed me pictures. And it was there for 3 years. And they used the strongest anti-parasitic medication known, and he still had it. Now, everybody else in the family ate the same food, drank the same water. Why did they not have parasites? And once we started working with him, and once his heart rate dropped, the parasites went away. Because that's the way it should naturally be. And one of the indicators that we're bringing that parasympathetic, almost every kid we work with, their heart rate is too high. And that's because, and we've actually published data on this. So again, it's really about understanding what is the root cause. Now, that being said, because everybody that we work with has an imbalance, and whether it's a right brain or a left brain, they all have this sympathetic dominance. They all have a deficit of parasympathetic. And that's why many adults struggle with gut issues, their whole issue, or they have gluten sensitivity or whatever. The other thing is that the sympathetic nervous system drives the immune system to overproduce antibodies and make them too sensitive. And so that's why we develop food sensitivities or eczema. And that's why it can be seen often from almost day one when they already have an overactive immune system. And when dairy is introduced or cow's milk in formula, they start with reflux or they get eczema right away. And we already know they have an overactive immune response. And so we understand this. We look at it, and there's very clear things to balance out the immune system. We identify what foods they're sensitive, because no two children out of 200 foods, no two kids are going to have the same sensitivities to the same degree of foods or even non-foods like food dyes or things like that. So we individualize with almost everybody the diet, but you can't get someone to change their diet if you don't change their ability to feel hunger and thirst. And so that's another big thing, that you have to change that. So it's very important in what we do, but there, again, we understand what we're really trying to do, and understanding the neuroimmunology at the highest level is really important. But we also realize that that's not the root problem. Okay? All right, I think that's all the time we have right now.
Thank you
for
very
questions.
much, Doctor.